Hello, welcome to our podcast, Zach and Ben's bullshit podcast, where we mostly argue about various pop culture topics and try to have fun doing it. Today, Zach and I have 5 topics to argue. I'm here in Altadena, California. Zach is in Lawrence, Kansas. We are connecting via Skype, and we have a very special guest. Our listener, Jason Beets, is calling in also on Skype to judge our rounds. So rather than haggling over who won at the end of each round and sometimes declaring it a stalemate because we both think we won, we'll have someone actually giving us a judgment on our arguments.
The only problem with this now is we won't have someone who wasn't on the podcast actually listen to the podcast afterwards.
So yeah, that's me. I'm Jason, and I have listened to all of the back episodes. Also, I was roommate with Zach a few years back, and a good friend with Zach and Ben in college. So
yeah, when we joke about Jason being our only listener, and when we mention Jason all the time, it is because he really actually is probably our only listener that isn't related to us. Alright, so our arguments that everyone can look forward to. For round 1, we have the best album of the 2010s. For round 2, we have the best debut album. Round 3, we have the best MCU movie performance, and we're restricting this to just performances in the clearly defined Marvel Cinematic Universe that started with Iron Man in 2008. Just to do it that way. And then for round 4, we have our dream pick for who K-State's next football coach will be, but it has to be within reason. So, like, Nick Saban wouldn't be within reason because he's never going to leave Alabama. So these have to be realistic options, but your dream pick for K-State's next coach. And then we're going to close it out with the best Harry Potter minor character. So, our opening round, and Jason had no idea what any of these arguments were going to be beforehand, and he has no idea what our picks are, so he is coming in completely blind. So his judgments will be based entirely upon how well we actually convince him of whatever we're saying. So this should be pretty fun. And Jason, I apologize in advance for when I get upset at you if you go against me. All right.
okay.
So our first
that's to be expected.
Yes, I mean it's going to happen at least 3 times. So our first argument is for the best album of the 2010s, and I picked an album by an artist that I've gotten into recently. That is Sit Resist by Laura Stevenson. Her band name is actually Laura Stevenson and the Cans, which the first time I saw Laura Stevenson, because how I found out about her was I randomly went to a concert with our friend Trevor at the Renata in Lawrence in early October, and saw her perform, thought she was great, bought 3 of her albums from her at the show, and then bought the 4th one on iTunes because she wasn't selling physical copies of it at the show. I actually asked her, why is your band called The Cans? She said, oh, it's kind of a joke. We couldn't think of a band name, so we just called ourselves The Cans, like we're just kicking the can down the road, and it just stuck. And that's what we've called ourselves since then. Like, that's pretty funny. But the reason I think Sit Resist is the best album of the 2010s is because it's really interesting both musically and lyrically, which is something that is very important to me, because an album can be interesting musically and I can listen to it and I can enjoy it and I'll have a good time, but if it's not interesting lyrically, it won't be something that really stands out to me or something that I go back to. Whereas Sit Resist and all of Laura Stevenson's music, in my opinion, has really interesting lyrics that deal with really complex themes like love and loss and depression and pain. And if you've listened back to the old episodes of the podcast, you know why that stuff resonates with me specifically. What I didn't realize the first couple of times I listened through the album, but I realized the last time I listened to it, I listened to it and the album that Ben chose as his pick, which I also really enjoy, so we're going to see how that goes. But I didn't realize that there is a very subtle and interesting narrative structure that runs through the album, that if you pick out the lyrical clues in each song as it goes along, it's there. And I didn't notice it initially because my first experience with listening to her music was it's about 50 songs. Her catalog's about 50 songs. I dragged it all into an iTunes playlist. I put the playlist on shuffle, and I just listened to that playlist over and over and over again to the point where I've listened to that playlist probably like 25 times, and I'm not even joking. If you look at my iTunes plays, I've listened to every one of her songs at least 20 times by now, and the ones that have stood out as my favorites more than that. But recently I said, okay, now that I know I like all of these songs, now I want to see how these albums actually play as albums, and they all play really well as albums. This one is the one that stands out the most to me, though. It helps that it has my favorite song by her on it, which is Master of Art, and one of my other 2 or 3 favorite songs by her, the concluding song, I See Dark. But if the narrative flow of this album is, it's someone's slow descent into, it's their slow descent into what ultimately destroys them. And if you listen to the album while also looking at the lyrics at the same time, and you can pick up on those clues, you'll recognize this. So, like, the first song on the album is called Halloween's Part 1 and 2, and I'll just be brief because this song doesn't have that many lyrics. The lyrics are, I am underneath, watch me take your life, watch me take your life. I am overlooked, I hear every word you say, watch what you said, I am underneath, I am underneath. The subtlety there is that it's that thing inside of you that you know, that you've repressed, that you know if you ever let that out, it could explode out in some way that was unimaginable, that could just slowly gnaw away at you and eat away at you, and you know it's always there, and you know you can't ever do anything about it, and you're always just kind of worried about how that is ever going to manifest itself. And it's really interesting that, like, that is how the album starts. And that song has a really cool, interesting musical vibe to it because it sounds kind of eerie and ominous, and you hear that and you're like, okay, I don't know exactly what I'm about to hear and what the rest of this music is going to be, but I know it's going to be really interesting and I'm going to be captivated the whole time. And then you go into Master of Art, which is the second song, which kind of has, like, these themes of, like, love and being difficult and the difficulty of relationships, and saying like, you love this person, but you're also kind of difficult and you don't know if they can handle being around you. And that, like, my favorite lyric my favorite lyric in the song is, I could lie and say to you that this will soon be over. I could lie and say to you where we'd be waking up tomorrow. Which is basically saying, I could lie and say that I know where this is going to go, and I know who I'm going to be and what I'm going to want to do, but I have no idea, and you just have to accept the fact that I have no idea, and if you want to be with a person who is kind of difficult and doesn't really know what they are or what they want to be, that those are just things you have to accept, and a lot of people aren't willing to accept stuff like that, and that is why relationships are so hard and difficult. And then you have songs like Caretaker and, like, Healthy One. Caretaker is like the song about kind of moving away from home and, like, going out and striking out on your own. And I'm not going to read the lyrics of that just because I don't want to have this take like 10 minutes. I'm trying to be as brief as I can.
It's already taken a long time, yes.
Yeah, this is just how this goes. And anybody that listens to the podcast knows that this is how this goes. And then, well, okay, I'll be brief and I'll go back to the points later. At the end of the album, you get to when everything is falling apart and you get to I See Dark, and it's the lyrics of I See Dark are, I'll just read the first verse and I'll read the last verse. Cuffed to the bed next to my head, swallow the key up, swallow the key. You've been swallowing everything. Lock me up in a room with the strange one, and then it goes on from there, and it builds and builds and builds, and you have this big explosion at the end, which is, because I've seen dark, and I cannot write it, like write, R-I-T-E. I've seen dark, I know you are tired of fighting. We'll lay with the lights out. I'll lie if you want me to, but I will lie. I will lie next to you. I can hear them too. I can hear them too. So it's just this little succession of not like a big thing ever going wrong, but it's just all of the little things going wrong that eventually destroy you and take you down. And that resonates with me because you guys know, and anybody listening to the podcast know, before last August, that is the path my life was on. And now that I know that there is that narrative flow in this album, it makes me like it even more than I already did. And I had already picked this as my favorite album since the 2010s before I even realized this was there. And this makes me like it even more. Sorry, I went way deeper than I was expecting to, but I just had to do that once I noticed that. Sorry, go ahead, Ben.
That's all right.
So I guess
ahead.
before Ben begins his argument, I will say, Zach, that was a very powerful lead. Just so I understand the category, it is best album of the 2010s, so just not the single year 2010, but the decade.
Yeah, it's released since the year 2010.
Gotcha. Okay.
All right.
Because Sit Resist was released in 2011, and Ben's pick I'll let Ben say what his pick is, but I think it was released in 2012.
Yeah, I think so. All right, so my pick, for those of you who are, I cleaned my house, got my taxes done. It's great. During Zach's opening, so
Fuck you.
So my pick is Almost Always Never by Joanne Shaw Taylor, and first of all, both these albums that Zach and I picked are excellent albums. They're both moderately successful, but not nearly as well known as they deserve to be. They're both really, really good. So first, why, a little background on my album and why I like it so much, and then I'll get to some counterpoints, I guess. But so Joanne Shaw Taylor is one of my favorite artists, and her, I was really sucked in by her debut album, White Sugar. Her guitar playing is incredible, which is, of course, something I like very much, but then also she's a very good singer, and she's one of the best songwriters in blues music currently, and that really elevates her material, the fact that she can combine this great talent with these really well-crafted songs. And Almost Always Never is her third album, and it is where she really found her core voice and said, this is how I'm unique, and this is what my sound is. Starts out incredibly with a song called Soul Station, which has a great intro and great energy, and this really wild guitar solo that just makes you really sit up and pay attention to this is going to be something new and different from what I've heard before. And then throughout the album, she does a really good job of kind of going back and forth between songs that have great energy and intensity, and songs that are more contemplative and have a more introspective feel to them, like Beautifully Broken and Almost Always Never and Lose Myself to Loving You. Some of the guitar solos are really wild, like Soul Station or Maybe Tomorrow or Jealousy. Some of them are really just beautiful and almost lyrical themselves. Zach says, for Zach, he identifies with the lyrics more. For me, I identify more with the music, and some of these statements, like the beginning to some of these guitar solos, like on Beautifully Broken or Almost Always Never. It's to me, those are the lyrics, where she's kind of bearing her soul with her playing, and that's what really stays in my mind. Some of the like my favorite song on the album is Maybe Tomorrow, which has this overdubbed guitar solo where she's playing multiple guitar parts on different tracks, and then intertwining the guitar part between them, and I've just never really heard anything else quite like it. It's really amazing. It takes a little while to get into, but once you do, it's really rewarding listen. And so that's kind of what the album is like, how it speaks to me. And then I would say, for kind of starting my counter argument, so I don't really have too much to say against Sit Resist because they're very different albums. But what I would say is like why I think Almost Always Never is the top choice for best album of the 2010s is these like indie singer songwriters kind of like grow on trees. They're all over the place, and so Laura Stevenson does she's like doing way better than the rest of them, but it's still like it's very similar stylistically. It's just done better. Whereas Joanne Shaw Taylor is really doing something that needed to be done very badly for blues music in a couple of ways. First of all, she was like kind of the beginning of a new wave of female guitarists in the blues, which has been really beneficial, I think, for blues music because they've brought a new perspective both in their playing and their songwriting that's really kind of helped to revitalize blues over the last decade or so. And also, her songwriting is much more advanced than what's going on with a lot of blues musicians these days. There's a few others like the Tedeschi Trucks Band and Samantha Fish that have some very good songwriting, but a lot of songwriting in the blues is, just kind of rehashing old blues songs and kind of updating them, but not really doing anything that different with them. Whereas Joanne Shaw Taylor's songwriting, really takes new directions as far as exploring the depth of your feelings and in the lyrics. I mean, her lyrics are very good. I'm not going to quote them to the extent Zach did for his album, but then also just taking the guitar sounds in new directions and having new tones and solos that sound very different and have their own unique voice. So like why I think Almost Always Never is such a great album is, in addition to the music and the lyrics and the songwriting all being excellent, I think it also helps take show a way that you can take blues music, this genre that's been around for 100 years, and do something new and vital with it at a time where that was really needed.
Okay, so I kind of realized immediately when I was putting together my thoughts on this argument that unless you stumbled into something that I could just really, really hit you on over and over again, there was no way I was actually going to win because of how much I also like Almost Always Never. So instead of trying to counter that, I will bring up a few minor criticisms, but also fawn over how good of an album I think it is. So, one, you said that it's very good lyrically. I think it's her best album lyrically, and the lyrics are completely amazing on like the entire album. Like my personal favorite song is Soul Station. Like that is the song of hers that I would say the one criticism I could have of Joanne Shaw Taylor that I don't have of Laura Stevenson is that Laura Stevenson, I liked everything of hers immediately, and the first time I heard it, I was listening to it over and over and over and over again. Whereas I liked some Joanne Shaw Taylor stuff immediately, but it had to grow on me, and then once it grew on me, I was 100% committed and listening to it all of the time. And if you had picked White Sugar, I would have a couple of more criticisms of that. And if you had picked like Diamonds in the Dirt, then I could totally hit that Diamonds in the Dirt, some of the songs kind of sound like different variations that are pretty similar, or sound like variations of better songs on White Sugar, but Almost Always Never is just such a transcendently good album that even though it doesn't have like a narrative flow, and the first time you listen to it, like it plays more like a good collection of songs than an album, all of the songs are so good, it transcends that in my mind, and that doesn't bother me. Whereas in every other fight we've ever had about this, if an album doesn't flow exactly the way I wanted it to, it knocks it down a bunch of pegs, and almost always never doesn't flow exactly the way that I want it to. But all of the songs are so good that doesn't matter. So when you reach that point, I literally can't criticize it. So I'm not going to concede because I want to hear what Jason has to say, but I have no criticisms to make.
Okay, well, so I'll jump in real quick before Jason chimes in, but yeah, this for me, this was like of our fights today. This is the one where I'm like, okay, well, I really like I've enjoyed listening to Laura Stevenson since you got into her, and we did our favorite female singers bracket, and I think her singing and songwriting and arrangements are very good. But yeah, this was. Of the arguments on the podcast today, this was definitely the one I wanted to win the most, because it's like I've been into Joanne Shaw Taylor so much for so long. I want to come to the bat with something strong here. So
and what you said about how there are a lot of indie singers that have similar vibes to Laura Stevenson that don't do it nearly as well as she does. Like, she stands out among the group that is all trying to do the same thing. I had never heard anybody else that sounded even remotely like Joanne Shaw Taylor, and it blew my fucking mind the first time I heard it, and then when I started listening to it more and more and more, it blows my mind every time since then. So, and what you said about how her songwriting is even if to me personally sometimes it can seem a little bit stale, and like we've talked about, some of the stuff on some of the albums can sound kind of similar to other stuff, but it's actually trying the new things as opposed to just going back and redoing all of the hits. Be like, no, I'm going to grab this and I'm going to see where I can take this because there is something cool and interesting we could be doing here. I'm not just going to get my start by covering blues song that's been covered 100 times. And I think both of them are the total package of what you would want in an artist.
Mm-hmm.
But Joanne Shaw Taylor is just kind of a different level of the peaks she can reach, and I think her peak for me is Soul Station is unlike few things I have ever heard. So I will concede that Almost Always Never. I still like Sit Resist more, but I cannot criticize Almost Always Never in a way that would even give me a remote chance to win.
All right, cool. Well, Jason,
all right, so
your job has been made a little easier here, but give your thoughts.
Sure. Well, first of all, I, to my knowledge, have not heard either of the albums. And I realize that this is about argument and not about who is right objectively. Mm-hmm. So I will put that out there first and foremost. Secondly, you both had very passionate arguments in favor of your choices, and it seems like neither of you really raised too many criticisms of the other's choice. But perhaps surprisingly, I am going to give this one to Zach, because when he was going through how the song, one of the songs on the album, struck with him, the idea of all the little things just kind of building up, and how that can take a toll on someone. That not only resonates with Zach, that resonates with me as well. Zach and I are very similar in a lot of ways. We found that out when we started living together, and so I haven't listened to either album, and it sounds like you both had very strong arguments, but that in particular resonated quite well with me.
Okay, a surprise. Well,
although I didn't get to mention a lyric that I also really like from the song Barnacles on Sit Resist, this is another one of the lyrics that really stuck out to me the first time I heard it. And I'll just read this whole verse because the ending of this is so great. Scrape these barnacles, I am utterly yours. Take my lack of control and swallow it whole. break my excuses to leave over your bony knees and scrub the sweat away, make me clean. And this is the lyric that just stays with me every time I hear it. Please pull the bad dreams out of me. And that is done so well in the song because she embellishes it in just a perfect way that you know it's coming, and when it hits, you're like, yes, I get that. I understand that. This resonates with me. I think the reason why she resonated with me so well is that she just came along at the right time and is talking about a message that makes sense to me, and it makes sense to me now in a positive way of like, this is what my life used to be, and my life is never going to be that again, but this reminds me of what it was like, and it motivates me to never get to that point again, and it's done in like this really interesting and compelling way that is just that is something I enjoy listening to all of the time, and is a very positive reminder of how far I've come.
Mm-hmm. All right, so round 2.
So thanks, Jason. I appreciate that.
Now, of course, you have piqued my interest to listen to both of these albums in the future.
Oh, you totally should.
Yeah,
you totally should. Jason, Ben told me that when you went to go see Samantha Fish at the Junction City Blues Festival, you enjoyed her enough to buy her album. If you like Samantha Fish, you will definitely like Joanne Shaw Taylor.
Oh, good.
All right. So, Ben, do you want to go first for number 2?
Okay, yeah, sure. So, yeah, our second argument is best debut album of all time. So this is just throughout all of music, who had the best debut album, and for me, I am going to go with my favorite artist, Stevie Ray Vaughan, and his debut album, Texas Flood. Obviously, part of the reason is this is my favorite artist, and I love this album, so I can argue it passionately. But I also do believe it is it is worthy of the title of best debut album of all time. This is an album that was released in 1983. I can't remember for sure if it was I think it was recorded over like just 2 days. It might have been 2 weeks, but a very short time period, because these were all songs that Stevie Ray Vaughan and Double Trouble had really, honed and perfected during their years of being a under the radar band in Austin, Texas. And so when they were ready to record, they came out perfectly, with very little having to take alternate takes or anything like that. And so for me, my argument is actually for why this album is so great is going to be somewhat similar to the reasons in my argument for Almost Always Never in the previous fight. First of all, Steve Ray Vaughan's guitar playing is some of the best ever. Like, it's basically just Jimi Hendrix and Steve Ray Vaughan, and then, everyone else way below them in terms of best guitar playing. So this, album announces right off the bat that, this is a guitar player that like you've never heard before. And also his songwriting is not, it's not as original as it could be there. And there are some covers, but with the covers, he really does make them his own. Like, Texas Flood, you're never going to remember that that's a Larry Davis song. That will always and forever be a Stevie Ray Vaughan song. And in his...
To the point where I don't even know who Larry Davis is.
Yeah. I mean, admittedly, it is a pretty obscure... The original was pretty obscure. And then, his original songs are very well done and put together. So... like Pride and Joy and Texas Flood are like the two most identifiable songs off that album as far as like being ones that you'll actually hear on the radio. But then also like my favorite song on the album is Rude Mood, which is an instrumental with just this breakneck paced guitar that is, I mean, the title Rude Mood describes perfectly, what it sounds like, but just this, in incredible speed and fury in the guitar playing. Then you have songs like, Dirty Pool is another very good original song where he does this amazing thing that's, I think it's called tremolo picking, where he's in the solo where he's playing multiple notes so quickly that it's, almost sounds like it's just this one big chord swelling up, even though it's tons of notes being played all together. And then the final song, Lenny, is also a very great way to end the album. If you've had all these energetic songs throughout much of the album, and then you bring it down to this slow, beautiful lyrical instrumental that's a tribute to his wife, and how much he loves her. So that's there's the album flows very well too, I think, for me. It's the album that flows the best of his albums, and I think so the album is great, but then I also expand on that to say that for me this album, or well, I shouldn't say for me, for everyone, this album really came at a crucial time for the blues again, when there had been very little innovation in the blues in the 70s and early 80s, and then all of a sudden you have this guy come along who's so talented that people just have to sit up and listen and say, hey, this blues is something that's still vital, still going, you can still do something new with it, and is worth listening to. And then also just the inspiration that this album had for so many people of in the blues today. Like, if you're an up and coming young blues musician, and particularly especially guitarist, because that's the most common instrument in the blues, like, the person you want to be is Stevie Ray Vaughan, and that's because of what he did, especially on Texas Flood, is just saying, like, here is the kind of the pinnacle of what you can do with blues music and guitar playing.
And to expand on that a little bit, something that's kind of cool is, like, that's part of the reason why Joanne Shaw Taylor's nickname is JST, because Stevie Ray Vaughan's nickname was SRV, and, like, just three-letter nicknames that are just your initials when you're as talented as they are just sounds so badass. Like, yeah, sorry, just wanted to put that out there. But my pick for the best debut album is Please Please Me by the Beatles, which the Beatles are one of my favorite bands, and they're widely considered the greatest band, one of, if not the greatest band of all time. Or even if they're not necessarily, even if someone doesn't consider them the greatest band of all time, they recognize that they are quite possibly the most innovative band of all time, because they came around they came around in the 60s, and they did cool, interesting stuff in the studio that no one had done before them, and that people have been copying and imitating and reworking and building off of since. And they proved a lot of cool studio techniques, like the backwards guitar solo, were actually possible. None of this has anything to do with Please Please Me. I just wanted to get that out there. But the reason I like Please Please Me so much is I think it is popular music, or just that idea of what you would call pop music or popular music. I think this is the absolute peak of that, and nothing else has really come close to this. The production was really down and dirty, so there are 14 songs on the album. 4 of them had already been released as singles, so they had to record 10 more songs to get the album done. They did it in like 12 hours one day, and just a couple of takes for each song. So all of the songs they recorded that day, they have kind of like that a little bit of down and dirty, rushed quality, but it adds so much character to them, and it makes them so much more interesting. And the cool thing about the album is that the songs on the album cover cover like the entire pop spectrum, from like your up tempo rocker like I Saw Her Standing There, or Twist and Shout, to like a slower ballad like Anna, or like Anna, and there's another one that just isn't coming to mind. I should have listened back over this again before I went to it. It announced to the world what the Beatles could be, because musically and lyrically, their original songs on the album are really interesting. Like my personal favorite original Beatles song on the album is the song "Misery," which is just like this interesting, like up-tempo song about breaking up and getting dumped. It's like 2 minutes long, but it's just great. And every time you listen to it, you're singing along to it. And they elevate the covers, all of the covers that they did, especially the cover of Twist and Shout. They elevated them to the point that when you look back at those songs, you're like, oh, that was a cover? The Beatles did that, especially Twist and Shout. The Beatles did that so well, I just thought that was a Beatles song. Who were the top notes? Nobody remembers who the top notes are. And if you can cover, it's like you said with Texas Flood, like if you can make a song so much your own and so much more interestingly that people don't remember the original person that did it, that's really saying something. I guess I also really like Texas Flood. I also really like Stevie Ray Vaughan. Of all of the blues artists that I got into because of them, Stevie Ray Vaughan was the first one that I took to really well and was listening to his stuff a lot. I guess the only criticism I could have of Texas Flood is that a lot of the songs on the album got better and more interesting the more they were played live, but that's not really that much of a criticism. That just speaks to how good of an artist Stevie Ray Vaughan was, that he could take those songs that were already really good and take them to a whole nother level when he played them live. And like, he could just be playing a guitar solo, have no idea what was going on, but just keep playing and playing and playing, and everything sounded like it was totally perfect and planned out, when if you read the stuff about him or you listen to the interviews about him, it wasn't. He was just playing, but it seemed like he always knew where to go. So, the only thing that can be kind of disappointing about Texas Flood, if you've heard all of the really cool live versions and all of the really cool, like, oh, this is what this song could be compared to what it actually is on the album, but it's not saying that those aren't still really, really good songs, because they are. Those are just, in some cases, one of the lesser interesting versions of those songs. But that's not really a criticism, though. That's just one of the only things I can think of that stands out to me. The one song that I will kind of criticize as, compared to how good it is live, is being kind of disappointing on the album, is like when he played Dirty Pool live and like slowed it down, it sounds so much better than the little bit faster version that's on the album.
Yeah, although that definitely is a product of you hearing the live version first, because if you'd heard the studio version first, you'd be like, oh, I already fucking love the studio version. The live version's even better.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's totally fair.
So I guess my to start my counter argument here. So with Please Please Me, and I think your points of there are some really excellent songs on the album, and it is kind of the pinnacle of quality for 60s pop is what the Beatles did in their early career. But my counter to that is, first of all, the songs do sound rather dated at this point. Like, you can tell, like, this is dripping with, like, this is the 60s. Like, it's not the cheesy bad 60s. It's like, oh, this is the good 60s, but it's still the 60s. Whereas, like, for Texas Flood, I think because it's in less of a mainstream genre, like, it has more of a timeless quality of, like, this could have been recorded any time since electric guitars were invented, and it would still sound like as good or innovative regardless of when it came out. But my other point is that, like, since we're talking about the best debut album, and of course it's hard to separate the legacy of the artist or band from the single album. But if you just looked at these albums by themselves, like say the Beatles recorded Please Please Me, Stevie Ray Vaughan recorded Texas Flood, and then neither of them ever recorded anything else ever again. If you look at these albums just like that, with Please Please Me, I think we would look back and say, wow, you know, they had whatever happened to that 60s pop band. Like, they had some really good songs, and then just they never really did anything. Because with the Beatles and their legacy, like, while their pop music in the 60s was really good, like, people didn't learn the lesson from that of, like, if you make really, really good songs and then perform them with great vocal harmonies and all this, like, then you can make pop music that's actually good. No, people immediately went back to making shitty pop music for a long time longer, whereas the lessons that they did take from the Beatles was the stuff from their later career of doing the really innovative stuff in the studio and making really interesting rock concept albums and stuff like that. Whereas with Stevie Ray Vaughan, if you took Texas Flood just by itself, like, it still would have inspired this wave of renewed interest in blues music and saying, like, you know, I can, you know, a lot of young musicians saying, I want to be a guitar hero like Stevie Ray Vaughan and play the blues and do this interesting, cool fusion of blues and rock music. Like, that legacy of what Stevie Ray Vaughan did, like, he came out, like, the Beatles evolved so much over their career, which is why they were such a great band, but, like, Stevie Ray Vaughan came out pretty much fully formed, and everything that he represents to the legacy of blues music was already there in Texas Flood, and it just got, you know, refined a bit more in some of his subsequent albums and live performances, but it was already there in the complete package of Texas Flood.
Yeah, well, if we're just, Jason, I have, like, another thing to say, but, if this, I would say, I think, just personally, from my listening to Stevie Ray Vaughan, I think he is most refined in his complete package form on Couldn't Stand the Weather, which was that his second album or third album?
Second.
Yeah. So, but your points of, yes, we didn't really learn the lesson. We didn't learn the lessons from the early Beatles career. We learned the lessons from the later Beatles career. Those are pretty valid. Yeah. Jason, what do you have to say? I just wanted to, yeah, go ahead. I don't have anything else.
Okay. Well, I am much more familiar with both of these artists. I've known the Beatles, pretty much my whole life, and then with Stevie Ray Vaughan, Ben introduced me to his work as well. I'm sure I'd heard it before, but I hadn't recognized it as his. But two very strong picks, very well argued. Very much until the very end, I was like, oh wow, I have no idea how I'm going to decide this. The clinching argument was perhaps the last one made, which is that if you're just looking at the album by itself, as opposed to the artist's entire career, then
I had no way to counter that.
Right. But yeah, literally up until that point, it was neck and neck the whole time. Again, two very good arguments, very well argued, but I will have to give this one to Ben.
Yay.
Yeah.
All right.
that was like, fuck, I have no way to counter that. Pretty much all I can say is, well, I think Couldn't Stand the Weather is a better album, but you're right. Your album completely changed what blues music was, whereas the stuff that my group did that completely changed music was like 6 albums down the line. Fuck.
Yeah, because I was like, okay, obviously the Beatles, like, are so hallowed that I need to come up with something good if I'm going to argue against them. So it took me a while to think of that argument, but once I did, I was like, okay, I've got some here.
Yeah. And something that if like Revolver had been the Beatles' first album, I might have been able to counter that.
Yeah.
Or if like Sgt. Pepper had been the Beatles' first album, I might have been able to counter that. But I I just love Please Please Me because that's my favorite Beatles album, and I've argued, not on the podcast, but in other situations, that's the best Beatles album successfully. But you can't really point at, well, but the Beatles are the most innovative band of all time if you're arguing for one of their first 4 albums when they weren't really doing anything that was that innovative. They were just doing what everyone else was doing way, way, way better than any of them could even dream of doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, because, I mean, yeah, I'd say, like, of course, the 2 most famous songs, I think, would be I Saw Her Standing There and Twist and Shout, and then, like, yeah, some of the other ones you mentioned, like Misery's kind of grown on me because you've beaten that into me a bit, but yeah, it's pretty good.
Although I will say, well, she was just 17, you know what I mean? Isn't that good of a look in 2018 anymore?
True.
Alright. So our third argument is for the best MCU movie performance. So the best performance by any actor starring in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And our picks won't be that surprising to any MCU fans, but here we go. So my pick for the best Marvel movie or MCU performance is Chris Evans as Captain America. And I think Chris Evans, and I actually wrote this out, so if it sounds like I'm reading off of a sheet of paper, I am, because I thought of this, and I was like, I want to make sure I have this written down, because I don't want to forget to say any of this. So, Captain America is kind of the moral standards that the Avengers strive for. His judgment and, like, well, not his judgment, but, like, his upstanding moral character is what influences a lot of not just his decisions but their decisions. He is the thread that really ties them together, and he stands up for his beliefs regardless of the circumstances. So, like, part of the reason why the Avengers broke apart in Captain America Civil War is because Captain America was standing up for his belief that the Avengers should have the autonomy to act in a way that they see fit in the best interest of the world. And sometimes if bad situations happen because of good intentioned actions, that is something that we have to be okay with. We have to be okay with saving as many people as we can, and if we're restrained by the government and we can't intervene in these situations in the way that we see fit, in a way that we think we should, then are we going to start doing more harm than good? Now, the reason Chris Evans is perfect for this role is because Captain America's character is supposed to be really rigid and unflexible, and Chris Evans brought that out perfectly. He had both the physicality to really convincingly portray the super soldier, but he was also, and I don't mean this as a criticism, this is going to sound critical, but this is actually very well acted because this is what this character needed. He is just witted enough to portray someone who is that rigid and that unflexible and that willing to stand up for their beliefs and at all costs. And the reason I think this Chris Evans performance is the best MCU performance is because Captain America could have gone wrong in different hands. Because it would have been really, really easy to just overact him and lay it on really thick and make him just really, really insufferable. But Chris Evans was able to make a character that shouldn't be interesting, it isn't supposed to be that interesting, really compelling, and you root for him because you want to root for him and not just because he's a superhero. He's someone who I have to like. And Chris Evans brought the subtlety that was needed that I don't think a lot of other actors would have brought out, because we've seen some other actors in some superhero movie roles that just kind of overdo it, like, well, not superhero movie roles, but like comic movie roles, like Jim Carrey in The Mask, where he's really overdoing it, and just the people that just lay it on way too thick, and they're like, oh, I'm in this big superhero movie, I'm supposed to be having fun and like going for it, just going crazy. And Chris Evans had the wherewithal and the realization to realize that no, that is not what this character calls for. I need to portray this as kind of like this rigid, unflexible wooden guy, and I have to be okay with that. And because go ahead. That's what I got.
Okay.
Chris Evans was perfect for the role because he brought that necessary subtleness to it.
Okay, so yeah, these two picks that we made are pretty obvious. Like, I think if either of us had not picked the one we did, like, the other would have picked it, because my pick is Robert Downey Jr. as Tony Stark as Iron Man, and so in the Avengers, basically Captain America is the heart and Iron Man is the brain. And for me, actually, my favorite character and performance is Chris Evans and Captain America, because he has that moral center and always does what's right. But as far as what I think is the best performance, it is Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man, as Tony Stark, and actually Iron Man and Tony Stark, even though Iron Man is the superhero, Tony Stark is the man. They are. I'd say Tony Stark is almost more important to this portrayal than Iron Man, because in Iron Man he's just he's in the suit. But most of what he does actually is as Tony Stark, the as he says in Avengers when he's arguing with Captain America, genius, billionaire, playboy, philanthropist, of like, he has this incredible technical knowledge, he has this incredible, this vast business that he runs, and he also, is in charge of logistics and planning for the Avengers, but also is this visionary person who can see the big picture of what's happening in the future and plan for it. So what starts out, like, what draws you in at first with Robert Downey Jr. as Tony Stark is that he's this kind of witty, sarcastic, kind of bit of an asshole guy, and really funny and entertaining and slick, suave, whatever. And if you can go for a long time and just think, oh, that's all there is to him. But then you realize, once you've really seen a bunch of the MCU, you realize that there's a lot more depth to it, because with Captain America, he's a guy who always wants to do the right thing, and he always knows what the right thing is, and he does it. With Tony Stark, he's a guy who wants to do the right thing, but he doesn't know how, and he's constantly trying and fucking it up and facing the consequences and trying to deal with this pile of shit that's half his fault and half the fault of whatever supervillain he was fighting against. And so there's a lot of complexity beneath the surface of Robert Downey Jr.'s performance of, like, here's this guy trying to put on this face of he's always cool and in charge, and things are just falling apart, and he doesn't know the best way to deal with it, but he's still trying and trying. And so, even though the glib one-liners are what might stand out the first time you watch, there are some really key, underlying emotional things, like, when he has the cameo in Spider-Man, and he's suddenly, this guy who's had no responsibility for anyone other than either his singular self or the whole entire world and nothing in between. It has to be this father figure to this teenage superhero who's trying to figure out what he's doing. And then, two of the most emotional moments and of course Captain America's had some very emotional moments too as well, like with his friend Bucky Barnes later becoming the Winter Soldier and having to fight him. But two of the most emotional moments in the Avengers franchise are, one, in the original Avengers movie when the mysterious council of big government people has launched the nuclear missile at Manhattan to destroy the wormhole where the alien invaders are coming through, and Iron Man realizes that the only way he can possibly stop it is to redirect it through the wormhole at the aliens, and he doesn't know whether he's going to make it back or not. He assumes he isn't, and he barely does. And so that moment, like where his AI butler Jarvis says, would you like to call Miss Potts, who's his love interest, and who he works with, and he's tries and he doesn't get a hold of her, and he realizes, I'm going to be sacrificing my life, something I never thought I'd do, and I haven't even told this woman how much I care about her, and people think I'm an asshole, but here I never thought I'd be sacrificing my life, and here I am willing to do this, like how much he's grown. And then the other moment is in Infinity War when Thanos has snapped his fingers, causing half the population of the universe to disappear like that, and Spider-Man is disappearing, and that's like Tony Stark's protege, and of course he's a teenager, he's got his whole life before him, Spider-Man is, and he doesn't want to go, and so it's very emotional from that perspective. But then you look and you see Tony Stark, Robert Downey Jr., and just how much it affects him, of like, here I've been working for years to prevent this from happening. I saw it was going to happen from the first Avengers movie, and I worked, and then it totally blindsided me. I totally fucked up. Half the universe died because I couldn't stop this. But not only that, this person who I've invested myself in his life and developing him as a young man and a superhero just died in my arms, and I couldn't do anything to stop it, and I'm still here. Like, so obviously it's hard to separate character and actor, and a lot of what I'm talking about are great character moments, but the reason that they work so well is because Robert Downey Jr. does such a good job of showing this guy who puts on this glib outer face, but who has all this deep internal conflict that he's just suppressing and bottling up and letting it eat him from the inside.
Okay, so the way I look at this is that I think the degree of difficulty for the Chris Evans performance is a lot higher than the degree of difficulty for the Robert Downey Jr. performance, because if you followed Robert Downey Jr.'s career, part of the reason why Robert Downey Jr. is good as Tony Stark and is good as Iron Man is because he is pretty much playing himself, and the path of growth that Tony Stark goes on throughout the course of the series is a lot like how Robert Downey Jr. had success early in his career, then he kept falling down and fucking up, and he was an alcoholic, and he was a drug addict, and he had all these problems that he came back from, and he became a successful Hollywood actor again. But it seemed like he had those years and years and years where he could just never quite get out of his own way. So when you look at Tony Stark, Robert Downey Jr. is really kind of playing himself and doesn't necessarily have to put on as much of a character and act as much as Chris Evans does. Plus, the character that he has to work with is a lot more interesting than what Chris Evans is given, because Robert Downey Jr. can have those fun moments, those fun one-liners. But the fact that Chris Evans brings out what he brings out in his portrayal with a character that, one, like I said earlier, one, in the wrong hands would just be way too over the top and be unconvincing, or also in the wrong hands would be way more wooden and just wouldn't be interesting. You brought up in Infinity War, the most emotional moment was when Spider-Man died. Well, the most uplifting moment, especially in the theater I was in, when I watched it, the whole crowd cheered was when I think it's Proxima Midnight throws that spear at Scarlet Witch or whatever, throws that spear off into nowhere, and someone catches it in just a dark alley, and you find out it's Captain America. Or Steve Rogers after giving up the Captain America mantle after Civil War. My theater fucking lost their shit when that happened. So I think what makes Evan's performance better is that he brings more out. He gets more out of less, and he makes a character that could otherwise be kind of boring and bland really interesting and noteworthy, whereas Robert Downey Jr. has really good material to work with, and he doesn't necessarily elevate that material more than anybody else who could just be kind of joking and wisecracking and quick and witty, but also had their own personal demons that they could bring out in the character could.
Well, perhaps. I don't know. I think, and you do bring up a good point about, like, how Evan's character is something that is, it is somewhat difficult to walk that line. But I think, it's hard to criticize because, like, it is true that Robert Downey Jr. and Tony Stark have a lot in common. But it's hard to criticize that because, like, I don't think anyone else could really do that character, quite the way that Robert Downey Jr. does. And it's like, yeah, his life of, fighting and recovering from drug addiction and thinking his career was going to be pretty much over, and then coming back to this great success, like that is very similar to a lot of what Tony Stark goes through. But obviously it's great casting that they picked him, because I think anyone else having that much of a responsibility throughout the MCU franchise, it would have been really hard not to make that character kind of unbelievable. Whereas because Robert Downey Jr. does have that background, like, it's totally believable every time that Iron Man gets in his own way by being an asshole, or every time you see that struggle of him trying to do the right thing but just not knowing how, like, that is just as believable as the parts where he's being this fun playboy billionaire guy. And I just don't see someone else really being able to pull that off to the same degree that Robert Downey Jr. is. And I think that's why the MCU works so well, is because like all the major characters are cast so well that you almost can't really imagine someone else doing that. So it's really hard to make that argument against either of our choices, just because they have both embodied their characters so well that you really can't imagine someone else doing them justice.
I mean, I don't think it's necessarily that no one else could do the Iron Man character justice. Yes, they wouldn't be as good as Robert Downey Jr., but that is a very meaty role that has a lot of interesting lines that other good comedic actors or other good dramatic actors that can step into different roles, they could do well with that, and it wouldn't be as good as Robert Downey Jr.'s, but they could probably bring something interesting out of it. I think the Captain America character, just the way that it's written, so many people that are in, like, these big superhero movies, they would look at that and they would say, fuck it, I'm in a big superhero movie, I'm going for it. And they could be like what Dave Bautista did with Drax the Destroyer in Guardians of the Galaxy Part 2, where he lost all of the subtlety, and that was partially the writing, but it was also his acting performance, where he lost all of the subtlety that made Drax interesting and a good, fun character in the first movie, and he just went for, oh, Drax is just like this crazy, ridiculous Joker now. Whereas even when they've tried to bring a little bit more out of Captain America, Chris Evans has had the wherewithal to know that I need to keep this as a consistent portrayal, and I need to do I need to do the best with like not as interesting of a part as Robert Downey Jr. has, and I bring this part out really well. I might shoot myself in the foot by saying this, but I think Chris Evans would be more interesting as Iron Man than Robert Downey Jr. would as Captain America, because I don't think Robert Downey Jr. could tone it down enough to actually play Captain America, and I think Chris Evans could. He wouldn't be nearly as good as Robert Downey Jr., but I think he could at least be a passable Iron Man. Where I don't think Robert Downey Jr. could even be a passable Captain America. I don't think that's necessarily as valid of a criticism. That's just something that came to mind while you were talking.
Yeah, well, I think that is true, but that comes down more to casting than it's like, well, they both got cast correctly and gave the performance that role needed. But I was thinking like, just while you were talking, I was thinking like, is there another example of like someone giving like who I think could give a performance similar to what Chris Evans did based on their role in another movie? And the one that came to mind, because like I don't think that it really has been done in superhero movies, but the one that really came to mind for me was Viggo Mortensen as Aragorn in the Lord of the Rings series, because once again you have this guy who is a really talented actor and could do a lot more with the character, but realizing that being this stoic moral center who just is humble and does the right thing rather than jumping up and being like, I'm the king, I'm gonna save you all, is like, I think it can be done. I think it's just that we haven't seen it done elsewhere in superhero movies, but I think we've seen it done in other genres, like the fantasy epics like Lord of the Rings. So I think it's not so much that no one else could do what Chris Evans did. It's just that, but I do think that it is important that he had the wherewithal to say like, this is what I need to do.
And with the Robert Downey Jr. performance, it is pretty telling how just kind of a running joke in a lot of Screen Junkies Honest trailers with more stuff that has come out since Iron Man, like Ant-Man and Doctor Strange, and there's another one, but I'm not remembering it. They joke about, and Star-Lord kind of like it, they joke about how, all of these other characters are kind of in the Iron Man mold, so you could maybe see one of those. Benedict Cumberbatch's Iron Man would be completely terrible. I will concede. I will not say that he could play Passable Iron Man, but I think Paul Rudd could maybe bring his fun like vibe that he brings to Ant-Man to Iron Man, just be a little bit more serious about it. I think Chris Pratt probably wouldn't be that interesting as Iron Man, but he could maybe pull it off. So you have these other characters in the MCU that are kind of in the Iron Man vein, where I could maybe see one of those. They would be miscast, and Downey Jr. is better than they are, but I could see them actually doing that. So,
well,
yeah,
but
I go with your point, if there are other characters, there are other people that you could see doing the Chris Evans thing.
Yeah, true. Although I think, with the other performances, it's more that they are distinct characterizations if you look beneath that quippy, jokey surface, and it's more just like an example of both how the Iron Man character was so good and the fact that the MCU has been going on for so long that the writers sometimes repeat themselves, that there are all these characters that have this surface level similarity, but then when you look below the surface, like none of those other characters really have that leadership aura that you get from Tony Stark and Robert Downey Jr.'s performance of like, oh, this is a guy who's actually seen some shit and matured, even though he has this brash exterior.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't really have much else to say, so Jason, what are your thoughts?
Okay, so much like the first round, I have very little exposure to the underlying content.
Mm-hmm.
So definitely Ben and Zach, you are both much more movie junkies than I am. I watch maybe one in theater a year, and then watch a few reruns on DVD a year, and that's pretty much it.
Well, Jason, that's why you were perfect to judge this, because you have no preconceived biases that you're bringing to this argument. It's entirely how well did we convince you.
Yes. And with regards to like superhero movies in general, like I think they can be well done, but I just think there's so much fascinating stuff that tends to go unexplored about like real world questions of how you deal with a real crime that is not like super over the top dramatic. Like when I was watching one of the more recent Batman movies, and they played the Joker as like having a million plans all at once, and you stop him in one place and then he's doing some maniacal thing elsewhere. It's like that's too powerful of a character. So it's like, and the moments in superhero movies that really resonate with me are the ones where it really does seem like, okay, this is similar to the kinds of questions you have to deal with in the real world. So to that extent, then I kind of liked the moment where you were describing Tony Stark, deciding whether or not to say goodbye to his love interest. But then on top of that, when like you were describing, like, oh, there's a bomb and there's a wormhole and there's aliens, it's like, kind of like if they would have taken that same idea with something that was at least somewhat plausible, so that I could like suspend disbelief, as opposed to like, oh wow, this is totally ridiculous. Like that would have been more compelling than it was. Obviously, they're part of the same cinematic universe, and they exist in some of the same movies, I take it. But I liked Zach's argument of, okay, to what extent should these forces be restrained, and to what extent should they be given autonomy? Because that is very similar to a lot of difficult law of war questions that do come up quite regularly when dealing with very big, scary questions, and kind of having the dynamic of someone who is trying to decide, how do we deal with this on the ground in practice, as opposed to what we might think, at the drawing board or in the ivory tower. So ultimately, I'm going to give this one to Zach, although it's virtually a coin flip. It was a very close round.
Thank you.
All right, sounds good. Yeah, and if I were arguing for Chris Evans, the moment I would have highlighted was because this is one of probably my favorite moment in the MCU is from Captain America: The Winter Soldier, because like in that movie, his friend and his childhood friend and later army buddy Bucky Barnes has been brainwashed by the Russians and then later by Hydra, this secret organization that's trying to overthrow the government, and so he's become this entity called the Winter Soldier, and so Captain America has to fight him to stop Hydra and from enacting their plan. And so there's this moment where they're getting ready for this final showdown, and Falcon, another one of Captain America's allies, says like, I don't think this is the kind of guy you reason with. I think this is the kind of guy you stop, and you have to remember he doesn't know you, Cap. And Chris Evans just says he will, because he's like, I'm going to convince him that he's still got his humanity and he's still my friend. And it's just like, oh, that was such a great moment.
And when he does, at the end of the movie, he does it where they're fighting, and they're ridiculous, like third act superhero fight, which is a lot more subtle and well done than a lot of the other ones. But when Bucky is beating him and is gonna kill him, like he says, I don't remember what he says before, but he says, well, because I'm with you till the end of the line, and meaning, like, we're going to be friends forever, it doesn't matter what happened to you. That if I had remembered that in the moment, I probably would have brought that up, but that is a really powerful moment as well.
Yeah.
So,
All right.
so quick question for you though. This wasn't going to factor into my decision making, but do you think that the movies that Iron Man and Captain America are part of would be well adapted to live theater?
No.
Probably not. I mean, it would be really hard to do that with any superhero movie. Like, I think you could make some of the, like, I think the closest, because it is more of a personal and friends conflict, would be Captain America's Civil War, but you would have to scale it way, way back and take out a lot of the supporting characters and a lot of the fight scenes and just focus on that relationship between the two friends turned enemies.
Right.
I'm going to take a pause before the next round to get some water, and then we can go on to round 4.
I will also take a pause before the next round to get some water. And on a side note, Alabama is losing by 2 touchdowns in the middle of third quarter.
Yeah.
Jason, you should say something as some kind of running commentary during the break. It'll be like those episodes of Movie Fights where they had the pee break commentary.
Oh yeah. Okay. So I am very good friends with both Ben and Zach. I would say they're probably my 2 closest friends. They were part of my life during some very important times in my life. Very interesting seeing where everyone has gone thus far following college. I still remember all of us hanging out quite merrily. But we had a good time together when everyone would come over to Zach and I's place. And I remember all the different places Ben lived in Manhattan before he moved to the West Coast. It'll be interesting to see if in future movie fights, if his added cinematic knowledge grows from his current job where he's watching lots and lots of movies to supply metadata tags. That has kind of given him some knowledge outside of what he would typically see. Some more obscure films, some more foreign films, things like that.
So Jason, how much different is the experience of being on the podcast as opposed to just listening to the podcast?
Yeah, and of course I did public occurrences, music public affairs show as well, so I have some, I guess you could say, on-mic experience. I also did some Facebook Lives for the Salina Journal on election night as the results were coming in. So there's a little bit of that nervousness when you're like, oh, I'm being recorded, people are going to be listening to this, a bit of the butterflies in the stomach, which is typically not something you get when you're simply listening to content. But it's very similar in many ways. Also, I guess it's a little different knowing that you are deciding vote for the only vote in the winner, as opposed to just observing, figuring out the different sides of it.
By the way, Ben, you're gonna have to leave this break in because Jason gave some pee break commentary.
Yeah, I heard that was going on. Yeah, I just got back up here, so yeah, I'll definitely leave that in. Sounded like he was saying nice things.
I realized the timing of that because I heard you take a drink of your water in the background.
All right.
Oh, on a side note, Jason, I already told Ben about this, but I now can do an honest-to-God actual push-up.
Yay.
Yeah. It's one of those things where you don't realize just how hard that is to actually do, and how much like I really am pushing up my entire body with my forearms and my shoulders until it's like I can actually go down to almost the floor and come back up. I can only do like one or two at a time, but the fact that I can even do that feels ridiculous.
Yeah.
Yeah, in PE growing up, K through 12, when we would do push-ups, I could never do it, and it was like super embarrassing. Like, I mean, I guess like I never really prided myself on like my physical ability, but it was just like, oh, everyone's else doing this, and I'm supposed to be doing this, and I can't. And everyone can see that I can't. So,
I mean,
it's
go ahead.
While we're on this topic of being kind of transparency, it's kind of like when you're in math class and like say you fail the test, other people can't see that you failed the test. But like when you're doing these tests in PE, like they can see that like, oh wow, you really are out of shape. There's this one test called the pacer, which tests like your endurance. It's not just can you do a sprint to this distance, but how long can you keep going, running essentially. And I was always like one of the, if not the first one out in my class. I just do not have that endurance ability.
Yeah. All right. Well, are we ready for the fourth argument?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I guess you went first last time, right? So it's my turn to go first. Okay.
And maybe we'll keep with the pattern of the person that argued first wins the point.
Yeah, right. Okay, so the round 4 is who should be who, if you could pick anyone within reason, would be the best person to be, or would be your dream pick, to be the next coach of the Kansas State football team, because Bill Snyder. Huh?
Oh, I was just going to say really quick, kudos to whoever chose that category. That's a great pick.
Oh, well, that was Zach. So, yeah.
And did we explain at the beginning of the podcast what we meant by within reason?
Well, kind of.
Yeah, you talked about it a bit.
Okay, so what I mean is within reason. It can't be like, oh, I want Nick Saban or I want Dabo Swinney. You can't pick someone who is at a job they would never leave to come to K-State. This has to be someone who is like at like a smaller school that is looking for a chance, or someone who's been around the block a couple of times who deserves another chance at a bigger school that you would want to come to K-State. That could conceivably actually end up here the way Les Miles ended up at KU. Nick Saban would never leave Alabama for K-State, because if you could have any dream pick, that's probably who we both would have picked.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay. So yeah, and then of course the other part of the inspiration for this is Bill Snyder's been just this amazing, legendary coach for K-State, but he's getting into his late 70s, I think, and it's
he's like 78 or 79.
Yeah, and so we've it seems like the football program has fallen off a little bit in the last couple years. This was our first season with a losing record since the last time Bill Snyder retired.
Well, our first regular season with a losing record.
Oh yeah,
we had a losing record when we lost the Liberty Bowl, but. Yeah, this was the first losing record and miss a bowl game season since 04 or 05.
Yeah. So then the question, of course, is, since we don't know when Bill Snyder will retire, but if he does, who would we pick to replace him within reason? So, of course, Zach had a pick right away because he'd been thinking about this more. I had to do a little bit of research to figure out who, but I've come up with a candidate who I think would be a good person on all accounts to take the job. So my pick is Neil Brown. He is currently the coach at Troy University, which is a school in Alabama that's part of the Sun Belt Conference, which is it's in the same division as all the big schools, but it's like one of the conferences that's smaller and doesn't have very much prestige, and teams in it, struggle to break into like the rankings of the nationally ranked football teams. So there's quite a few things that I think, quite a few reasons Neil Brown I think would be a good pick. So his background, he's started as he had several smaller coaching jobs, and then he got to be the offensive coordinator at Troy. Then he went to Texas Tech from 2010 to 2012 and was the offensive coordinator and quarterbacks coach there. So he has experience playing in the Big 12, the same conference as K-State, and knows, how to put together a good quality offense in this conference that is dominated by really good offenses. And I think that's one good thing is that, part of the reason K-State struggled in the last couple of years is because our offense has been really bland and predictable, and so I think he's kind of got the know-how of how to put together a more dynamic offense that could actually, put up the points to win an offensive battle type of game. Then he was the offensive coordinator at Kentucky for a couple of years, and then took over at Troy in 2015. And so at Troy, and this is a kind of an interesting coincidence that I think fits really well for what he would step into if he was taking over after Bill Snyder at K-State. At Troy, he took over from Larry Blakeney, who had been the coach for I think 23 years or something like that at Troy, and had gotten them all the way up from I think a Division II or something, a lower or level to Division I FBS competition. So had grown the program, had a bunch of winning seasons, but then in his last 4 years had fallen off, went 3-9, 5-7, 6-6, and 3-9 in his last 4 years. So had a legendary coach with his name on the stadium, much like Bill Snyder, who had fallen off. Neil Brown comes in, takes over. The first year goes 4-8, but then in 2016 went 10-3. 2017 went 11-2, and 2018 9-3. So he's gotten the turned around this team in very quick order, knows what it's like coming in after a legendary coach, knows what it's like coaching in the Big 12 and putting together a dynamic offense. And so I think he's the kind of guy who would be able to come into K-State, know what he was getting into, revitalize our offense, kind of handle some of the pressure that would come with taking over for a legendary coach, and hopefully get us back on track to have some good winning seasons, get us back in some bowl games. He's won both his bowl games so far with Troy as well, so that's positive. So Neil Brown is my pick.
All right, so my pick, he's been around for a while. He's been around the block. Is Lane Kiffin, who is currently the coach at Florida Atlantic, which is a Conference USA school. But Lane Kiffin has been a known commodity since the mid-2000s. He came up as the offensive coordinator for Pete Carroll's, or one of the offensive coordinators for Pete Carroll's great USC teams in the mid-2000s. Then he got hired for a short time as the coach of the Raiders. He was the youngest head coach in NFL history, but he stepped into a bad situation with the Raiders because Al Davis is insane, and Al Davis was insane by the end of his career, and he didn't succeed in Oakland, but then he got a job at Tennessee coaching there. He coached there for a year, and then he ended up at USC, which is where he had been the offensive coordinator under Pete Carroll, and they had high expectations for him. In his first season, he went 8-5. In his second season, he went 10-2, and they finished in the top 10 in the final AP poll, but weren't eligible for a bowl. So everyone looked at that USC team and thought, oh, they're going to be really good the next year. Well, despite still having a bunch of NCAA sanctions against them, like scholarship reduction. They were voted number 1 in the preseason poll for 2012, and a couple of things went wrong at the beginning of the season, and it kind of spiraled, and they ended up falling to 7 and 6 and finishing unranked, and it put them in a really hot seat, and he ended up getting fired for starting out 3 and 2 the next season. And something that has followed Lane Kiffin around his entire career was that he was young and seemed a little bit entitled and seemed like kind of a punk, and he kept part of what happened at USC is that he wore out his welcome a little bit. And then in 2014, I think it was 2014, let me make sure, it was 2014, I think it was 2014, out of the blue, he got hired by Nick Saban, who is the coach at Alabama, who is the most successful coach in our lifetimes, and it's not really even close. He's won 6 national championships in the last 18 years, including 5 in the last 9 at Alabama. And even if they lose to Georgia today, they'll probably still get in the playoff and have a chance to go for their 6th and their 3rd in the last 4 years. And he went there, and he seems to have grown and matured, and like he's a good offensive mind. The most frustrating thing about watching K-State the last couple of years, and Ben mentioned this, is how our offense is so vanilla, and we've been running the same offense for 20 years, even though the game has just left that behind. Bill is so resistant to change because he's still doing the same things that he did to build the program, and that worked when he came back and he revitalized the program, that just aren't working now, and he's lost the team, and it's become kind of stale and played out, and the players aren't responding to it. We need to get someone who will bring those new interesting stuff to the table. And in the last couple of years, his time with Nick Saban seems to have matured Lane Kiffin quite a bit, to the point that when he got hired at Florida Atlantic in his first season, he turned around. I think they'd been terrible the year before. He turned him around, took him to an 11-3 record, won Conference USA out of nowhere, and he signed a 10-year contract extension at Florida Atlantic when everyone thought that, oh, Lane Kiffin's back, he's immediately going to go jump into some big conference job and see what he can do there. But it's like, no, he's showing a level of maturity that he wants to be somewhere where he is appreciated. And K-State is the kind of place where if you come here and you succeed and you show progress, you will be appreciated the way that Bill Snyder was at the beginning of his run. And I think because he's already been around the block and he's taken his lumps, Lane Kiffin is at the point in his career where if he came to K-State, he succeeded and he was appreciated, he would stay here. And the administration is looking to hire another Bill Snyder, another coach that will want to spend 20 years at K-State, and you have to be at an interesting point of your career to be willing to make that commitment to a program like K-State. I think Lane Kiffin is at that point of his career because he's already done the gig at the bigger schools in the SEC and the Pac-12, and he knows how much of a shit show and how contentious that can be, and how you get fired just quickly for nothing. And like one season where you don't live up to expectations, and then a cold start to the next year gets you fired. And it's like that, and it's like that in all of those jobs, in like the SEC and the Pac-12. And K-State isn't like that. If he came here and he showed progress, and the team was at least fun to watch, people would respond well to that. And I like Neil Brown, and I like the points you made for Neil Brown. The only thing that worries me about Neil Brown is that he's on his way up, and I feel like he would use K-State. I don't know this for sure, but I feel like when you look at how their careers have gone so far, he seems more likely to use K-State as a step stool to like a job in the SEC or a job at a bigger school, or like a job at a Texas or something like that if it came open, whereas Lane Kiffin seems like he's at the point of his career where if he had success and he was appreciated, he might just settle in and say, I'm going to spend the rest of my career here the way that Bill Snyder did.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, I think you do bring up a good point with the 10-season contract at Florida Atlantic. That's something I didn't know. And it's hard to know exactly with Neil Brown because if you look at their ages, like Lane Kiffin is 43,
43.
and Neil Brown is 38. So they're both pretty young coaches, but I think yeah, it's possible that either of these guys, it's just hard to know how long someone's going to stay. It's very rare that you get a Bill Snyder who's going to coach 20 seasons at a place. I think, Neil Brown's done 4 seasons at Troy, so I mean, I think, if we can get a coach who does 4 or 5 seasons at K-State rather than just like pulling a Bob Huggins in basketball where he coaches for a year and then goes somewhere else, like, I think that's a positive, because you can at least build something off that and remind people that, hey, like, K-State is a good place to work even if your name isn't Bill Snyder and you're not a legend. Like, we can still offer a good job for you. But I think there's a couple things that concern me with Lane Kiffin. And I think, and it's possible, I don't know. I mean, I don't watch like coaches' press conferences or stuff, so I don't know exactly how his demeanor has changed. But it is concerning that, he had a lot of in the big expectations head coaching jobs, like whenever because there's some coaches who can like underperform, but they'll inspire, they'll be able to inspire enough confidence to say like, hey, I had a bad year, I had a couple bad years, but I can turn this, like, the program is still with me and we can turn this around, and rather than getting sulky and being like, hey, I've lost the team, I've lost the fans and stuff. So I'm a little bit worried about Lane Kiffin's ability to keep the fans. The other thing that concerns me is in his first year at Florida Atlantic, he went 11-3, which is a really good record. This year he's gone 5-7, which is the same record that K-State has, and they're talking about Bill Snyder should retire. So, I mean, it's a very small sample size at Florida Atlantic, and given his experience, he can probably turn it back around, but it's concerning to think, like, if he comes into K-State and does a similar thing where he has a good year and then he has a bad year and it's kind of uneven, because he is a big expectations coach of like, hey, you were at USC, this big school, and you have this coaching experience. He's the kind of guy where you're going to come in and expect him to be really good right away, and then when he doesn't, like, I think K-State fans, like, as loyal as we are to Bill Snyder, the reason we're loyal to Bill Snyder is because he has done so much for our program and turned it around from the worst program in the country to a real contending program. And like, we don't have that loyalty to other coaches, because when you hire someone new, it's what have you done for me lately? And as nice as we like to think we are, K-State fans can be kind of mean. So I don't like to think what happens when you bring in a big expectations coach. Things don't go as predicted. He has trouble handling it, and the fans turn on him. Like, I could very much see that happening. Like, I think Lane Kiffin has had the best success as an offensive coordinator, and I think the best situation for him would be, I mean, if he stays with Florida Atlantic, that's great, but if he wants to get back to a major school, would be saying like, hey, I've had my best success as an offensive coordinator, like at USC and Alabama, where I don't have to be the face of the program that deals with all the backlash from the fans and the press. Like, I can just run my part of the program and not have to worry about that shit. Whereas because Neil Brown is coming from a smaller situation and doesn't have the big weight on his shoulders of the expectations of like, hey, you've coached a big name school before, like, you have to be really good right away. I think we would give him a bit more time and allow him to work his way into the role and see what he can do before we pass judgment on him, as long as he was putting on a good face for the program and the team was behind him. Like, I think we would give him a few years to really let the program take off rather than turning on him as soon as things went badly, like we probably would with Lane Kiffin.
I don't necessarily think we would. Jason, I'm not done yet. Oh, you have a question? Okay, what's your question?
Okay, my question that you can work into your ongoing rebuttals and back and forth is that coaches don't only deal with, trying to establish a winning record. Sometimes they deal with or create actual, genuine controversies above and beyond the performance record. I was watching a documentary with my dad this week. Around the year 2000, there was a basketball coach by the name of Knight who...
Oh, yeah, Bob Knight, yeah.
Yeah, actually...
Hitting a player, yeah.
Yeah. So, and then on top of that, you have the saga. I don't want to get into all the backstory here, but Joe Paterno not reporting something to the police that very clearly should have been done.
Joe Paterno reported it to the university administration, and they chose to bury it, and then he just followed the lead of the administration.
Right. So my question is, besides whether there would be a good coach having a winning record or not, and the team's performance on the field, which of these candidates would do better at handling other controversies that might arise with regards to them as a public figure?
I think that...
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, what I was going to say in my rebuttal was that when the team that Lane Kiffin took over was 3-9, so the fact that he turned them around 2-11 and 3-1 season is very impressive. And yes, you can expect a little bit of regression when you're taking over a program that before you got in there had been nothing, and he had success that wasn't necessarily expected right away. But because he had that success that wasn't necessarily expected right away, that's when that gets you that built-in level of patience to go, 2 or 3 years of saying, okay, we know that you can succeed and you have the chance to put your system in place. I don't know how really to respond to how would he deal with other controversies that would arise as a public figure, because if you look at the record of young Lane Kiffin, who didn't respond to that stuff very well, then you could really say that, well, we have all of these instances of how he's responded badly to these situations and how he's become sulky and disinterested. But from his time at Alabama and from the mistakes that he's made and from the various places that he's been, he appears to have matured quite a bit, so I don't know how he would respond to those situations now. But I don't necessarily think that is what K-State is looking for. K-State, like I already said, is looking for a coach that could run a solid program and would be willing to stay for an extended period of time. So it doesn't matter that someone like Neil Brown could be a really appealing candidate. I don't think he is the kind of person that the administration, and Lane Kiffin probably isn't either, but I think Neil Brown is even less of the kind of person the administration would even look at, because they would see him as someone who would just leave. And the Bob Huggins situation, that where we got screwed there is that the job at his alma mater opened up, and he had planned on staying at K-State for an extended period of time, and then the West Virginia job opened, and he was like, well, I've always wanted to coach my alma mater, I gotta do that, which I can't really begrudge him for that. That was just unfortunate bad timing.
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah, that's true. So yeah, I mean, I guess in response to your question, Jason, it's really kind of hard to tell, like, because of course for me, like I'm picking someone who is very young and very early in their career, so I just I don't really know much about Neil Brown because I haven't I just like literally did some research and picked him for the sake of this question rather than he was someone I already had in mind like Zach did. So I don't think he's had any serious problems that he's had to deal with in his early career, but that's not surprising when he's only been a head coach for 4 years and he's only 38. So it's really hard to predict how someone is going to respond to controversy until a controversy happens, and of course, for a lot of people, they just go their whole career and there really isn't anything. Whereas, like with, and of course, most of the time when you do hear about a controversy, it is because someone handled it poorly. But also, I think who you really have to worry about when there is a controversy is the university president and the administration, because obviously the coach is in charge of the football team and the players and how they behave, but then also, like, as much pressure as there is, from the coach to handle situations that come up, there's even more pressure from the university administration, because the coach, well, I mean, it's the as big a business as the football team is, like the university is an even bigger monstrous entity. So I don't know, it's really hard to say for someone who hasn't had a controversy how they'd handle it. So I mean, I don't think Neil Brown's really had anything, and then anything Lane Kiffin has had has been related to the actual whether the team was winning or losing, rather than anything more sordid or sinister that might have been happening, like what would have happened at Penn State or something like that, or a school that had
also Baylor under Briles.
Yeah, although of course, I mean, I guess you do have with like, so yeah, I mean, there wouldn't be anything like anywhere near that. I guess, like, I guess Kiffin would have been at USC when they got as an offensive coordinator, and that would have been Pete Carroll's fault when they got penalized by the NCAA for some violations for, like, payments to players. But that's all. One, it was the head coach's responsibility, and two, like, those sorts of things are, while they look bad, they're not nearly as serious as people actually, like, getting physically hurt by the actions of someone related to the team. It's more just a rules thing. So I guess the response to your question is basically, it's hard to know until someone has a controversy, like how they'd respond to it. So like, either of these guys could handle it well or handle it poorly. It's hard to know.
Right. Okay. Well, does that conclude all of the arguments?
I don't really have anything else to say. Ben, do you have anything else to say?
Yeah, I think we'll go ahead and let Jason make his statement.
Okay. So, as is the case with several other of the rounds that I've judged thus far, I follow sports far less than the average American, particularly far less college sports than the average American. I do know that Bill Snyder is and has been a major institution, and that is not an understatement with regards to both Kansas State athletics, Kansas State football, and the university as well, and just for Manhattan, the city itself. So this is actually a huge decision, both with regards to whether he is going to continue, which at this point doesn't appear likely, but that's still on the cards. And if not, who his replacement would be. Definitely, I think that for coaches of major athletic teams, they really need to be trained by, the university administration in crisis management, which isn't to say that everyone's going to have a crisis, but if you do, you have to handle it well. And I think that is something, that is a part of the job that has been hugely overlooked by far too many for far too long. It doesn't appear that at this point either one of the candidates that you have chosen would necessarily do better in that capacity. One of the very strong arguments that I think Zach had was that his choice is someone that very possibly could stay at K-State for a while. I think that would be a huge benefit because of just how much an institution Bill Snyder has been, and actually having someone who people know, even who don't follow sports super closely, someone like me, that can attract some reputation and credit to the school and to the team. I thought it was interesting, Ben's argument that the fans' expectations would factor into how well they are perceived to do, regardless of how well they actually do in terms of the winning record of the team. And I think that's a very interesting argument, and maintaining support of fans is something that's important not just to the team but to the university as well. But I don't think that that's really a fair thing to consider when saying someone applying for a job. I think you have to judge them on the merits and less on how they would do compared to expectations. And so while I think these both sound like good picks, I would have to rule in favor of Zach, because the idea that we could have someone who could stick around for a while and kind of be another representative of the university in the way that Snyder has been is something that I think would be a very attractive, thing to have.
Sweet. Thanks, Jason.
All right.
Yep, you're welcome.
All right, so that would make it 3-1. But since I conceded the first round, but Jason gave it to me anyway, I think we should fight this fifth round as 2-2, and it's all on the line, because this one is the one I think I'm gonna have the most fun with, even though I had fun with all of these, and that is the best Harry Potter minor character. And I picked for the best Harry Potter minor character, and she doesn't appear that often, and I'm basing mine on the movie portrayals because I haven't read the books yet. I know some of the context from the books because I've become more steeped in the Harry Potter lore in the last year or so, but I don't know all of the details from the books, so please don't totally hold that against me. But I picked Bellatrix Lestrange, and the reason she is the best Harry Potter minor character is because the Dictator's truest believers are scarier than the Dictator themselves, and Bellatrix Lestrange is the truest and the most ardent and the most ride or die, I will do whatever the fuck you want me to do, Death Eater that there was. Every time she is on screen, she is completely and utterly terrifying. So she is purely evil, and she is committed to doing Voldemort's bidding at any cost for any reason. She will follow him to the end of the earth. In the Cursed Child, which can be canon, whether just depending. That is a whole bigger Harry Potter fan that I am, nerd fight, that I am going to wade into solely for the sake of the podcast. We learned that she actually gave birth to Voldemort's child, and that the main villain in the Cursed Child is actually like Voldemort's daughter. Like, she was so committed to Voldemort that she was willing to have a sexual relationship with him. She tortured the Longbottoms for just no reason. She tortured the Longbottoms because she thought that by torturing the Longbottoms, they would give up what had happened to Voldemort, when they couldn't have given up what happened to Voldemort, because no one other than a few people knew that all of his followers thought he had just gone somewhere. They didn't know that his body had actually been destroyed, and the only thing that was keeping him alive was the Horcruxes that he had created. And she killed Sirius Black, who was... Were they cousins, Ben? Were they cousins? I think they were cousins,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, they were.
Yeah, she killed Sirius Black with absolutely no remorse, and just celebrated it and ran around and laughed about it. I killed Sirius Black. Are you going to get me? Ha ha ha! So, I go back to the point of the only thing scarier than an evil dictator are their truest believers, and she is pure evil. She is pure, terrifying evil every time you see her.
Okay, so in this argument, just to provide a little more context, like how, so we're saying the best Harry Potter minor character. So we eliminated, of course, Harry, Ron, and Hermione, the three central friends, and then we also eliminated several of the characters that appear throughout pretty much like almost all of the movies and books, which would be Dumbledore, Hagrid, Snape, and Voldemort, and then anyone else was fair game. So my choice is Remus Lupin, and of course Zach chose a much more difficult person to argue because Bellatrix Lestrange has far less screen time and does far less than Remus Lupin. So Remus Lupin was introduced in the third Harry Potter story, Prisoner of Azkaban, and was a major part of that story, and then appeared again in a few other later times, such as the Order of the Phoenix, the fifth book, and the Deathly Hallows, the seventh book / seventh and eighth movie, because they split it into two. And so Remus Lupin starts as the defense against the dark arts teacher in Harry Potter's third year, and this is a position that's been kind of cursed because the no one has been able to hold the position for more than a year without something bad happening to them. But Remus Lupin comes in, and he is, he's the best teacher in that position that we've seen in the main Harry Potter stories, because he actually understands his kids and understands how to relate to them and teach on their level, and he actually becomes good friends with Harry Potter because he's a kind person and kind of understands what Harry's going through. And you also find out eventually at the end of that at the end of Prisoner of Azkaban that Remus Lupin was one of a group of friends that included Harry's father James and his godfather Sirius Black. So Remus and Harry have a good relationship with each other. Also, Lupin has he has kind of a dark secret, which is that he's a werewolf, and they do in both the books and the movies, they do a good job kind of like keeping that like as sort of something that he's keeping secret, but you see clues like when when they're doing the Bogart, which transforms into like the thing you fear most, and for Lupin it's the full moon, and then some of the stuff with Snape dropping some hints about werewolves and stuff when he's substituting for Lupin when he's sedated, so he doesn't go crazy during his werewolf period. So he kind of had, he's kind of this really kind person who has this dark side that you see comes through when he transforms into a werewolf at the end of Prisoner of Azkaban. But then at the end of Prisoner of Azkaban, he's actually forced to retire from the position because it has come out that he is a werewolf, and there is a great deal of prejudice against werewolves in the wizarding community, and he's not allowed to stay. So while he continues the tradition of not being able to be in the defense against the dark arts position for more than a year, it's because of people's perceptions of him rather than because some calamity happened to him, and he's able to continue being a friend to Harry throughout, like when Sirius Black dies, and he's the one who tries to restrain Harry from going after Bellatrix Lestrange. And then in the last movie, when Lupin dies in the Battle of Hogwarts, he's one of the people that comes and offers guidance to Harry in spirit form when Harry gets the resurrection stone. So he's kind of one of the few adults who is kind of a constant in Harry's life through the years, along with Dumbledore and the Arthur and Molly Weasley, for example. So yeah, that's kind of who Lupin is, and why he's a good character. As far as Bellatrix Lestrange, I guess I'll start with my counters here. The thing about Bellatrix Lestrange is she doesn't really do anything other than just be this cackling evil person who comes on screen at times. Like, she's just kind of this scary person who is there, and you're like, oh, she's scary, and oh, she looks evil, but she doesn't really have anything, there's not really any thing important with her as far as developing the story or developing the character. It's more just like, hey, this is like the kind of person that Voldemort attracts, so you can see like why Voldemort and his followers are bad, but she doesn't really have much to do, whereas Lupin is actually really important because he shows Harry that, hey, you can have like there's an adult who doesn't really have a responsibility for you, but who still cares about you and can offer you guidance in life. And when Harry, of course, is very much liking that in his home life, with since his parents are dead and his aunt and uncle, Vernon and Petunia, are just horrible to him.
Okay, so Lupin isn't the only adult that Harry has in his life that offers him guidance, that offers him advice, and he's not necessarily the only adult that doesn't necessarily have a responsibility for him that does that either. Like the Weasleys did. The Weasleys were doing that for Harry almost immediately as soon as they met him and he became friends with Ron. And you say that Lupin is kind of like this father figure to Harry. Well, he's not even necessarily the most interesting father figure to Harry. I think Sirius is a lot more interesting character in that role, and so is Dumbledore. But Bellatrix, the thing about Bellatrix Lestrange is that when she is on screen, she doesn't necessarily have to do that much because her presence is just that terrifying, because you know that she is so committed to Voldemort that she willingly went to Azkaban for him. And the whole time she was in Azkaban, a lot of the other Death Eaters, like the Lucius Malfoys of the world and the Karkaroffs of the world, either denied their Death Eater past or gave up as their Death Eaters to avoid going to Azkaban because they thought Voldemort was gone, Voldemort was finished. I've just given that up, and I'm gonna do whatever I can and give up whoever I have to give up to slither my way out of this bad situation. But Bellatrix Lestrange was so committed to Voldemort that she spent, 15 years in Azkaban prison, and when he came back to power, was one of the first people back by his side doing his bidding. So part of her evil cacklingness is Dumbledore's death has even more emotional resonance than it otherwise would, because she is being evil and cackling, and as soon as he dies, she's the one that runs to the window and casts the dark mark in the air with this huge smile on her face, haha, we've just killed some guy, but that's great because we're evil and that's just what we do. And she is so evil that when she died, her death in the seventh book, is incredibly satisfying, because you see just evil incarnate finally being defeated and finally getting the comeuppance that they deserved by Molly Weasley, who was kind of downplayed throughout the series as well. She has a lot of children and she's an important motherly figure to Harry, but we've never gotten to see what her actual skills are. And when Molly beats her in the duel and finally destroys this character who's just means so much terror. Has meant so much terror and just evokes fear in so many people. Is probably the scariest Death Eater that isn't Voldemort. Like, Lupin sometimes doesn't necessarily stand out among all of the other father figures to Harry, the way that Bellatrix Lestrange stands out as she is terrifying because she isn't just following Voldemort because it's politically expedient. She's following Voldemort because she actually 100% believes in everything that he is and stands for. And to me, like I said in the beginning, the truest believers of the dictator are scarier than the dictator themselves.
Yeah, I mean, sure, but yeah, I mean, by points, I think it's hard to offer too much to get your hooks into about Bellatrix Lestrange, just because she does so little throughout the stories that you can't say she. I mean, because yeah, what she does well, of just like, I'm evil and I'm scary, but that's all she does. I think with Lupin, like, in addition to being kind of a father figure for Harry, he also shows like what a good teacher can be, and in so many of the examples of what you see of other classrooms, and especially in the defense against the dark arts position, he shows like what a good teacher can actually be, because like you had the previous year you had Gilderoy Lockhart, who was just this stuck-up, pompous, full of shit windbag who only cared about himself. The next year you had Barty Crouch disguised as Mad-Eye Moody, who was terrifying the students and showing them these unforgivable curses that you're never supposed to do as a wizard. And then after that you had Dolores Umbridge, who's this horrible person who's just put in there by the Ministry of Magic to give Dumbledore a hard time, and doesn't teach the students anything, is basically just teaching them to a standardized test. Whereas Lupin, like, you actually see like he's teaching the students in a way that's actually resonating with them and making things stick. Like the scene where they confront where the students confront the boggart, which I mentioned earlier, where the boggart's this thing that takes the form of your worst fear, and then the way to combat it is to say the spell ridiculous, and then think of like some way to make that horrible thing funny. And so like Ron's worst fear is spiders, so when he says ridiculous, it turns into like a spider on skates, and is all awkward and ridiculous. And then or like Neville's worst fear is Professor Snape, because he gives him a hard time, and so he says ridiculous, and it turns into Snape in Neville's grandmother's clothing. So that I'm just explaining this for Jason in case he isn't as familiar with what's going on. But what's so great about that scene is you see that the kids are actually like having fun learning in a way that's going to stick with them. And you see that so rarely in so many of the other classroom scenes in Harry Potter, because they're focusing on teachers. The teachers that they focus on are ones who have baggage or who aren't good people. And so it's refreshing to see like this is this is a teacher who actually connects with the students and knows how to teach them. And that's why he is one of the best professors in the series, and also why he becomes such a good ally to Harry Potter, because he knows how to connect with young people and speak to them on their level. And it's not just like, oh, this is like grand serious magic stuff. It's like, no, you can have fun with this and learn at the same time. And I also love at the end of the third book when he was forced to take the Marauders map, the map that shows where everyone is that magically shows where everyone is at Hogwarts away from Harry, and then at the end he says, "Well, I'm no longer a professor, so here I feel no compunction about giving this back to you." Of like, you don't have to do things by the rules all the time. It's more important that to know that your heart's in the right place and you're doing things for the right reasons.
Okay, well, I don't have anything else to say, so if you don't have anything else to say, Jason said he had somewhere he wanted to leave for by about 6:15, and we're 10 minutes past that, so I'm content cutting it off there if you are.
All right.
So yeah, I have a bit more time. I looked in the performance at 7:30, not at 7. So,
I still didn't have anything else to say anyway.
So, I read or had the Harry Potter books read to me, all 7 of the books. And I have seen all of the movies, although it has been quite some time since I have done either for any of the entries in the series. Definitely, it really is a touchstone for our generation. We all kind of grew up with the books, and they were so well written, and so, I mean, the world was so well constructed, and it dealt with, issues of class and of race, with, Muggles versus, purebloods versus half-bloods, in ways that are really, really powerful, and deal with things that we deal with in everyday life in our world, but in a way that allows you a critical distance to kind of observe how it works without having to, feel like, they're talking about you specifically, or, something that you might have said or thought about something more contemporary. So, yeah, definitely a huge fan of the Harry Potter franchise. Again, 2 very well chosen characters. Very much liked Zach's argument that the dictator's followers are more scarier than the dictator, which again is another great parallel of how we tend to think of dictatorship as something that's far away, but there have been dictatorships in Europe, and there have been backsliding of democratic norms towards more authoritarian thinking and systems, and places that are our allies, and at times at home as well. So I thought that was a very good point to make. And the idea that it's not just, there's this evil villain. No, it's this evil villain who's powerful, not just because, he's a great wizard, but because he has supporters. There are people who are on his side, which is something that's often left out about many epic battles in movies and books. With Ben's argument, I was immediately captivated as I was reading the books, and just like, oh yeah, if there were actual werewolves, how much that would suck, and like actually having to try to navigate having that real handicap there, that you are involuntarily turned into a vicious monster. And in a lot of fiction dealing with werewolves in the past, really do just depict them as just monsters, And in Harry Potter, they get, what is it like to what would it be like for someone to have to live under those circumstances and try to be the best person that they can, while also trying to control something about themselves which is stigmatized and is in some ways beyond their control. So I thought that it was very, very impressive as well. Ultimately, I think that the werewolf character is a bit more complex, whereas with Bellatrix Lestrange, she's somewhat unidimensional. It's a lot. She's a lot more flat of a character by comparison, she's a very useful character in showing, just what the dynamics of the political and civil war struggles are in this world. But ultimately, I think I will have to go with Ben, just because I think that character is so instrumental in, just showing the personal struggle within the larger context of the society. Also, I just think that the idea of, it's a cursed position, the dark arts teacher, they always get fired or die or something horrible happens to them. I thought that was a very brilliant literary device or the running story within the series. So I have to do a shout out to J.K. Rowling for that as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was pretty worried about this one because I didn't really have a good way to knock Lupin, but as soon as I thought of that, God, Bellatrix Lestrange is Voldemort's truest believer, and those people are so fucking terrifying. I had to make that argument. This is too good, and it really helps that Helena Bonham Carter's performance in the movies, she's only on screen for maybe 7 or 8 minutes in the movies that she's in, but every time she's there, it's oh God, this woman is so terrifying. I remember the first time she comes on screen in Order of the Phoenix, and it's just the devil has literally walked on screen, and we've never met this character, but we've very briefly met this character before, and you just immediately feel that presence of something bad is about to happen. And I hadn't read the book, so I didn't know that she was about to kill Sirius Black. And I was my intuition that something really bad is about to happen was actually right.
Mm-hmm.
Because she just brought that with her everywhere. But had I brought that up during the argument, I don't think that would have mattered, because I had no way to counter Lupin's importance.
Yeah, and with Lupin, he brings the exact opposite feeling, and David Thewlis is in his performance in the movies of just this is someone who's actually kind and understanding, and you just can't help but like him, even though he does have this kind of dark undercurrent with the werewolf thing of this is just such a good, decent person, you can't help but like him.
Yeah, Jason, we were gonna have Brad judge the podcast, and he said he was going to do it, but he got sick and he had lost his voice, so he wasn't going to be able to talk, so he kind of begged off of it. So yeah, the timing of this was just very fortuitous.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, yeah, and thanks for being our judge. It was fun to have something different on this podcast.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And to just know that occasionally in my rebuttal, I don't immediately have to go for I can think of okay, what's a point I can make that is going to convince Jason that I am right, not necessarily what is the point I can make to completely tear this down, because the only way there's going to be some leeway either way is if one of us is obviously defeated and knows it, if it's just the two of us.
Mm-hmm.
Right, yeah. The margin by which you have to win when there's a judge, as opposed to when you have to reach consensus, is different, yeah.
Well, Jason, the next time we record a podcast, would you like to come on the podcast again?
Sure, definitely.
I mean, it's easy to be a guest on the podcast. You just have to say, sure, I'll do it. You don't actually have to, spend a decent amount of time thinking of what you were going to say. Which, I'm not going to lie, of all the podcasts we've recorded, this is the one I prepared the most for, because I knew we were going to have an extra person. So I wanted to make sure I was extra prepared to possibly, I was leaning toward convincing Brad, but making it up on the fly and having to change toward arguments that will convince Jason was interesting to have to try to do in like the hour before we recorded.
Yeah, true. Because with Brad, I was a bit worried too on the first two arguments because I was like, oh shit, I know he likes this type of music that Zach is arguing for more than the type of music that I'm arguing for. So I'm gonna have to like play up some of the other aspects of it that don't necessarily play as much to what I like about it. But so that was kind of an interesting thing of like, I was like, oh, how am I going to make this work? So that's actually kind of why I came up with some of the arguments I did, because I was like, oh, I'm going to have to go deeper into this than I normally would. Although, I mean, I think I still would have gotten there. It's just I had to think a little harder to make sure it was good.
Yeah.
Because I'm about to leave the conversation.
All right.
I will just put it down a mark.
So what performance are you going to, Jason?
There's going to be a performance of Elf at the Solana Community Theater.
Oh,